name is Ron Bleicher. I'd like to welcome you to the seminar series in Political Science and International Studies. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we live and work on Aboriginal time, on Aboriginal land at a time of unresolved political conflict. Our school seeks to understand and address this conflict and figure out how to engage better with Indigenous peoples and knowledges. And we have, in fact, a couple of the seminars in our series are on that topic, including the one that's coming up after today. It'll be a seminar, like that briefly, by Professor Sarah Madison from the University of Melbourne on her new book called The Colonial Fantasy, Why White Australia Can Solve Black Problems. It's an event that will be held in the city in cooperation with the Australian Institute of International Affairs on the 10th of September, Tuesday at 6 p.m. I'll be circulating information early next week, and we'd love to see you at that event. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Professor Ole Wæver from the University of Copenhagen. And it's difficult to introduce someone who is as prominent and as influential, as huge as Ole is in our field. Some people have written influential books. Some people have kind of established theoretical traditions that have become very influential. But it's very rare that we have a scholar who basically established an entire paradigm of studying politics. And that is, in many ways, what Ole has done with his work on securitization theory and the Copenhagen School. Like, for the last 3 decades, that's become one of the most influential frameworks through which we analyze politics, and particularly security issues. It triggered entire research programs, grants, debates, critiques, countless books, countless articles, countless PhD theses, including, as far as I'm aware, at least 2 PhD theses here at UQ that are about to submit it, one by Jessica Kirk and one by Paul Crawford, and there's probably other ones as well, and we have staff members who even have a Copenhagen t-shirt. Our resident expert. I looked up Ole's Google citation counts this morning, and it's well over 30,000 citations. I don't know if there's many or if any politics and IR scholars who would be as influential as he has been over the last 3 decades. Now, Ole will talk about securitization theory today. He will revisit it and expand it, so I'm not going to say much about that, but I'd like to flag 2 quick issues. One is, the first time I saw Ole speak was almost 30 years ago. It was at an ISA. I can't exactly remember, I think it was in Atlanta, about 1991, 92, but I remember 2 things. One of them was that it was a fantastic presentation at a time when the ISA was a very boring conference, like very uninspiring, very conventional, very mainstream conference. The second thing I remember about the presentation is that I was extremely pleased and extremely relieved that I was not the only one at the ISA with a thick European accent and English.
And that hasn't changed.
And the second point I want to make, Ole is obviously very well known for his work on securitization theory, but he also has done a lot of other work, and I'd like to just flag one kind of work he has done on basically going beyond Western kind of theories, Western epistemologies, Western forms of knowledge, and exploring other ways of conceptualizing security and politics. There's just 2 examples. One book from about a decade ago with Arlen Tickner on sort of international relations theories around the world that explores how a lot of non-Western kind of scholars have used epistemology that are non-Western to explore the theory and practice of international politics. And one book, which I just finished reading, which is very new, is with my colleague Anna Leander from the University of Geneva, that explores basically conflict resolution expertise from the global south, again as a way of sort of challenging the prevalence of Western epistemologies. You might want to kind of engage that, but I think for now we really look forward to having you here, Ole, and to talk about your work on securitization theory, where it's at and where we're going with it.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks a lot. Thanks for getting me here, and thanks for the introduction. And thanks for reminding that I'm interested in many other things than what I'm talking about today. So feel free, if you've been sitting puzzling over something crazy I've written somewhere else about something else, then confront me with it or whatever. Things I don't mention as much as things that I do mention today. I think I'm the last of my department to come here. I think you have probably had Lene and Simone and Rune and so on presenting here, and I'm really glad that finally it was my turn to come as well. I've heard much from my colleagues about how good feedback they've had, how interesting discussions, so I've really been looking forward to finally making it here. This will in many ways be an atypical talk for me. One thing, I will take knowledge of securitization theory more or less for granted, which I rarely do because I don't think it's true. I mean, not everyone knows and not everyone cares. But there are two reasons for doing it more or less today. One is that I am in a place where I know that people have actually engaged with it and it's been around. And secondly, I want to use my time to get to some new stuff. Therefore, I don't really feel that I have a lot of time to present it. And I hope that some of the general points I'm making are actually relevant, even if you maybe don't care that much about securitization theory. They are general points about how to theorize politics and so forth. And as I'm hinting by this also, by not really knowing how it's structured and how much time I have. This is the first time I'm giving this talk. You might be pleased about that or the opposite, that's up to you. At my own universities, that is Copenhagen and Sydney, I have presented the paper version of this and had people comment on it, but I've never given it as a talk before. So I'm very curious for your reaction. It's very, very much a work in progress. It's something that I'm going to spend most of my time on in the future. So any input and help and suggestions will be super welcome. What I'll do today is basically this. I'll start out from saying there's something called securitization theory. You'll hear a little about what it is. As Roland rightly said, there have been lots of debates, lots of criticism. You might even say that we've gotten to be the privileged position of being the favorite foil of everyone else, a bit like what Walls was in the 90s. Whatever you wrote about, it didn't really matter. You started out saying this is a criticism of neorealism. So then you had a hook for it, and a lot of people have been doing that on securitization theory. Take a journal like Secure Dialogue, it's hard to find an article that isn't to some extent a criticism of securitization theory. So then at least you have an excuse for doing what you're doing. So, and I get a one more citation for this. So everyone is happy. Those debates have to some extent consolidated into a kind of branching of the theory, that there are different versions of securitization theory. I'm probably in the minority position by now that the Copenhagen interpretation of the Copenhagen School securitization theory is probably not the most used. Probably what some call the sociological version, mostly associated with Thierry Balzac, has more followers in the sense that it seems more useful for what a lot of people do. So it's somewhat important for me to engage with those debates. And as I want to show, this involves going back to the theoretical basis of the theory in speech act theory. For two reasons. One is if you want to have, I hope people can see this even if I'm actually in front of this. So partly because this is the theoretical anchor of the whole thing. So if you want to be more precise and think more precisely about how to structure the theory, you have to get its theoretical engine right. And secondly, some of the criticism of my minority view of my own theory is that I've gotten speech act theory wrong. So therefore it's important to actually go back and check if I did so. I didn't, but anyway. So the basis of going there is from there to rebuild maybe a more precise and more interesting version of the theory. So we're going up from there to a new version of securitization theory. So this is and from there we can talk back to the debate, but potentially also it might actually point further in the sense of there might be something in there more generally about to theorize politics. As Roland was also hinting in the presentation here and his other things he said, some people treat the Copenhagen School as a general theory of IR or something like that. I don't think it is. I think it's important that securitization theory is a theory of security. It's not a general IR theory. But it might have wider implication at a meta level in the sense that there are things about how to theorize politics that actually could be used in completely different contexts. And some of that I'll hint at towards the end, the ways of theorizing politics. So the self-reflections might be helpful in a completely different context. So there might be a project in there of how to do politics with words. That I'll hope to say something about. In the announcement for this talk, it said that it's now 30 years since I coined securitization. Some might have been doing the counting and being puzzled about that, except that it's, in addition to the fact that it's a long time, it also doesn't seem right given what we know, because most references to the text are either to the 1998 book, Security: A New Framework for Analysis, this little one, which is kind of probably the most normal reference for most people, or my own article, Securitization and Desecuritization from 1995 in the Roland Lipschutz book on security. But actually, the first version when I put it on paper is indeed exactly 30 years ago in this paper called Security and Speech Act, Analyzing the Politics of a Word. And as you can see up there, it was presented at a research training seminar. So I have to tell a little personal anecdote here, especially for the PhD students. Basically with the morale, don't listen to the elders here in the room. This is more or less the PhD training I got. I went to the seminar, heard a talk by Steve Smith, and presented this paper. That's all. That was PhD training at the time. But that's not my main message here. It is that I presented this paper and had the idea of security as a speech act and so on, and I got the feedback from everyone, no. That is a crazy idea. Go bury it as deep as you can and try to do something useful. And so I did. So I put it away. And I didn't do anything about securitization or security as a speech act for years, until I got an email from Ronald Lipschutz in Santa Cruz saying, come, we want to do a crazy conference where you don't bring a real paper, you just bring a small think piece with your most crazy idea and whatever. I said, well, there was that crazy idea that everyone really thought was crazy, so maybe I should dig it out. And then it became the article and the project. So the morale here is that you shouldn't always listen when you're told that you're off the mark. As rightly said, there's been a lot of criticism of this theory. To summarize very brutally, strangely, there has been rather little critique from the mainstream. Securitization theory is in many ways a challenge to the mainstream, because security is not something objectively given. It's not about going out and measuring how dangerous things really are. It's about how we constitute things and so on. You would think that journals like international security or mainstream studies and so on could be a little troubled by that. But they're not. They don't keep on doing whatever they do and don't really care. So it's not like there have been lively debates between the mainstream and securitization. Most of the criticism has been, so to say, from the left, from theories that are more critical than ours, saying that it's not radical enough and so on. That again, you can say a lot of that has been specific, of saying something is missing. The theory is underspecified. It doesn't specify the role of media. It doesn't specify. It doesn't say enough about images. It doesn't specify has enough about history. There's not a theory of emotions or whatever. Of course, I could go through the list of all of that. I'm not going to do that today. I think that a lot of these criticisms, to some extent, maybe a little condescending, say it has if I wear my sociology of the discipline hat, has to do with the standard article format, as I hinted before about the foil and so on. Whenever you make an article, it's not enough that you've done a very good study of securitization of the Kurdish question in Turkey. You have to have a theoretical implication somehow. So you have to say at the end, this shows that the theory is missing this and that. So there are a lot of these that are to some extent a product of how we have to write our articles. And another problem has to do with not always thinking so clearly about the difference between something being missing in the theory or that your findings is that this was very important in my case. So there's a long list of things that probably should be given more attention, but maybe don't really accumulate into a big theoretical disagreement. But then the most important theoretical discussion in my view, and here I'm skipping a whole phase. I'm skipping here in a sense the late 90s and zeros, where there was a big discussion between the Copenhagen school, Paris school, critical security studies, and Aberystwyth. I could say a lot about that. If anyone wants to go into that and how it relates to what I'm talking about today, we can do that. But if I just bracket that and say what has happened after that is that there has been, to some extent, a consolidation of the criticism into a view of a choice between an internalist and an externalist version of the theory, as Holger Stritzel, and to some extent Matt, and Thierry Balzac have been arguing, or more often used between calling my approach a philosophical approach and the thing that others are doing a more sociological approach. I'll get back to this at length. So, but just the basic idea is that, in a sense, the Copenhagen version is too much of a speech act approach. It is too much assuming that things are happening in the speech act in a very narrow sense of being speech, being an act, being done by someone at a specific time, and so on. You have to include much more and look at the broader process of where people came from, their whole preconditions, the setting, the emotions, all of that comes together as a total process that then let security issues emerge and change and so on. This is, and as I said before, in order to address that, one has to think a little hard about what speech act theory is, and it was even raised in some sense, key text in this debate, a critical article by Thierry Balzac in European Journal of International Relations, that I got speech act theory wrong, and that is sort of the root of the whole thing. Before I get to actually then engaging with speech act theory and at the end, hopefully getting to what this means for securitization theory, let me just give a few hints of things that I think it's important to try to achieve by this exercise. Some of the qualities of the theory that I think it's important to defend, in a sense. So, I think there are three qualities that we want to keep or even consolidate when we develop the theory. One is that what securitization theory is, and then now I'm getting to something that almost makes up for a summary of the theory. This is the closest you get to getting a presentation of what it really is. The whole idea is that it's a way to capture how certain issues get constituted as ruled by a specific set of a form of politics. That there are issues that are no longer dealt with in our normal way, but now they are seen as security issues, and because they are security issues, you are allowed to use extraordinary measures. There are different rules applying as would if they were normal issues. So you can change political issues, moving them around between different forms or modes of politics. So it's a kind of meta-politics about how you shift issues into a different terrain from where they would otherwise be. The point is, if you make a super simplified version of what's the key of the theory, and also where I think some of the usages are flattening it in, and now I'm not talking about these critics, but more the kind of loose and more superficial usage of it that you sometimes see. Most people have gotten that somehow this is a criticism of viewing security as objective, as being constituted by the actual threats mechanically, automatically translating into the politics of security. So the first issue would be to say, the first position would be to say, when is something a security issue? It's a security issue when it's a security issue, when it's a security issue because it really is, because it's dangerous, because it can kill you. That's kind of the classical approach, right? So it's the objective that is the key to understanding when something is a security issue. Then most readings of critical approaches more or less assumes that it is moving from objective to subjective or to a thin form of intersubjectivity of saying it's how we think about it. It's not really whether they are security issues, but we think about things in a security issue. We conceptualize them and we are circulating these understandings on ourselves. That means that it's really about threat perceptions, about constructions, and how constructions are being communicated. That is how a lot of people treat the theory. In my view, that is to get it wrong. This is not the key to securitization. It's not a theory of threat perception and threat construction. The key is what happens at the moment when we are making the political choice to deal with something in a particular mode. That, to put it in a different way, the reason why we can't believe in the objective approach is not a skepticist or relativist argument that we don't know enough, you can't know how dangerous it is, you can't measure whether one thing is more dangerous than another. It is because The real ultimate reason is because we can't play history through several times. We are making a choice whenever we're confronting something to say this issue we're going to deal with by normal politics, or this one we're going to deal with in a securitized way, or this one we're going to deal with as a risk issue. We are making that choice, we're constituting it that way, we're going through it in that manner, and it ends up having consequences along those lines. So it's a particular mode of dealing with things and of constituting political issues, defined by the fact that something is constituted as being an existential danger, therefore some actors are given the privilege of, and also the obligation, to use extraordinary measures if necessary to deal with that threat, and a certain audience accepts that they will be defended on these means, and therefore in a sense also promised that it will be taken care of. So there's a whole deal being made there which constitutes the roles of who is being defended and who is defender, who has right to do what, who has obligations to do what. So constituting that form of politics on an issue then as an effect constitute that the issue has a certain nature and that the community defending itself also has certain qualities, that we become that kind of community who are having this form of politics and so on. In my view, it's important in that sense to be moved beyond the construction or the perception view, and especially the idea it's about perceptions that are being exchanged and circulated and communicated and so on. And there's a bigger potential to go beyond securitization, also to think about other modes of politics that take this form of. So that's the first point of what it is we want to say. Then maybe more familiarly, there's a politics of responsibility involved in this. The whole idea of the theory was to say, you practitioners and you scholars who talk about security, you're making a political choice when you do that. And you can't hide behind objective facts. If you say this is Russia is a security threat, we have to do this and that, you have to be aware that you are then making a political choice of securitizing that, and it's not something that can be settled by the issue itself, going back to the first point, because it's a choice to walk through our future on the securitized mode instead of something else. Whether it's a good choice or not, you can discuss, but you can't give an objective answer to say it really is a security. This means that it's your responsibility to do. So the responsibility can't be unloaded because there's not an objective threat to put it on, nor is there a kind of causal explanation of when things become security. And this will become important later on. If we had a causal theory to explain when things become security issues, we are in a sense also downgrading the responsibility, because then ultimately you can say we are all just wheels in this system and we end up there because it had to happen. Then you're not responsible for it. But that's why we shouldn't have a fully causal theory of securitization. And then maybe a little more unusually, it's not reversible either. It's not like we're just temporarily constituting things like that. We have done something in history that means from now on this has happened. And we can then do other things on top of it, but it can't be undone, it has happened. Which also points to a bigger responsibility. And then the third level is, as theory makers, there is a challenge of thinking about the politics of our scholarship, which becomes particularly complicated when you're a theory builder. It's often slightly easier when you're doing a specific study to see how your study is politically engaging with the subject you're studying. But making a theory, how do you judge whether a theory is politically good or bad? That's actually very complicated. I'll not say any more about it now, just that this is something that has actually concerned me. It's a bit ironic, given that that's something that I think I've been thinking more about than most people who make theories, how to deal with the politics of your own theory building. That's a bit ironic, given that there's an article coming out in Security Dialogue telling you all that securitization theory is racist. And those also, for some reason, have not engaged with my own attempts to think about how to make those kind of political evaluations. That's one of the funny things about that article. There are a few others. Now, I'm finally moving towards the key part of this, the securitization thing, but the speech act thing, but the idea here was to say, here are three targets that I want to be aware of. We should try to aim at doing this in a way where we salvage the 30 thing. And the key to how we do it is that the first, in relation to the first, that the key ability of the theory is to capture something about how you institute a specific form of relationship. The second is that you think about securitization as an event, not as a process. That ends up being a very important distinction. And the third is that it's important to have clear conceptual categories. A strong theory actually makes it more possible as a theorist to, in a sense, control the politics of what your own theory is used for or not used for. So, the relationship between securitization and speech act theory. That's actually a little strange in the sense that if you take a number of textbooks and read about securitization theory, half of them are not going to mention speech act theory. So some would think securitization theory has little to do with speech act theory. Others will make it the heart of the presentation and say that securitization theory is basically defined by being the speech act approach to security. That's maybe a bit confusing. Why can you have both? Why is it possible to both see it as not related and as being the heart? That's my fault, as so many other things. That's because in the original version of the theory, I did not start from speech act theory. I, in a sense, ended up in speech act theory. So I made an argument in general about how to think about what happens when you construct things as security issues and so on. And then almost as an aside, towards the end of the argument, I say something like this can be phrased as what in speech act theory is known as an illocutionary act. Thereby, of course, implying that you can also do it without. Otherwise, you can't put it like that, right? So in that case, I got to speech act theory. I didn't start from speech act theory. Then it's more gradually, as the debate has evolved, that it has become clear. Maybe there's a little more to it than that. Maybe you actually should take that serious, and there's actually some potential in it. And then on top also some of the criticism starting evolving around that issue. So that that gave several reasons to actually go back. And as I said already, we have these two versions of the theory now where this is part of the discussion. So let's get back to speech. As you probably all know, that there's clearly one place to go if you want to do that. Someone has just recently stolen my version of it, so I have a very neat new version of the book here. Yael Austin's How to Do Things with Words, which is the book defining speech act theory. Yael Austin, in his very famous philosopher, he only published 8 articles. That's his whole production when he was alive. It's maybe interesting comment to our times as well. Become great influence on philosophy based on 8 articles. Then posthumously, several books were published, and most importantly, in '62, these lectures from 1955 came out. In there, Austin coins a lot of new terms, like speech act and like, as we will get to, illocution and performative and lots of other things that we are with us today. In some way, it's a super fun read. I mean, go read it. It is super fun in so many ways, the way it's written and so on. Very different from the way we write today. But it's also very confusing in some ways. Part of it is, one of the main reasons is that intentionally, but it's not making very clear that it is intentional. The first half of the book builds the whole argument on one set of terms, and then he discards that and does the whole thing over again on different terms. Doesn't mean that the first is wrong, but it can't hold up analytically in the last. So the first version is the contrast between a constitutive and a performative. So this is a very basic argument that most of us tend to think of language intuitively as being a way of talking about things. So it's a way of constating of what Austin calls the descriptive fallacy, assuming that language is essentially something we use to make statements about something else, like saying it's raining outside. And statements like that have truth conditions. We can look out the window saying it's not raining. That's the standard view of thinking about language. And then the performative is different in the sense that the statement is the act. So if I'm saying here, this talk will take no longer than 45 minutes, this is a promise. That promise is not over there, and I'm talking about it. The promise is being made in me saying this. And it has happened. What has happened there? Then the relationship between you and me has changed. Now I owe you something. I've given you a promise. You have something, a claim on me, and the fact that I've given you that promise. That isn't changed in our social relationship. Before it was one thing, now it's a different thing. If, right, when I fail to deliver on that and talk longer than 45 minutes, it doesn't mean that that promise was not true. So it's not parallel to the truth condition. It just means that I have done two things. First, I gave a promise, and then I broke it. Two social events then. Not that one somehow means that the other didn't happen. On the contrary. So the focus here is on what happened socially, politically in a sense, between you and me in that moment when I gave that promise. That's the heart of the speech act theory. And remember that, because that's what then all the speech act theories have tried to ruin since then. So we have to save speech act theory from the speech act theories, because this key idea is what they have buried under a lot of speech act theory. Austin then ultimately gives up the hard use of that distinction. And that's basically because he's saying, in a sense, both are present in each other. A consultative is also a performative. You're also performing something when you're making a consultative sentence. He's using D.E. Moore's famous philosopher argument, the cat is on the mat, but I do not believe that it is. Why does that sentence feel strange? It's not technically wrong, it's not technically impossible to say it, but somehow you can't still. It feels outrageous. Why? Because if you make an empirical statement, you assume to either believe it or pretend it. You can't make it and say at the same time that you believe it's not so. So there's something performative even in the constitutive, and vice versa. The performatives also have some relation to their empirical reality. That means the distinction doesn't really work. Then he comes up with the more elaborate scheme of the locutionary, illocutionary, and perlocutionary act, which the same sentence can be doing at the same time, where the locutionary is the more familiar one of sense making. You're putting noises together and they make sense in some way. The illocutionary one, which is the most original one here, which is the one that, in a sense, carry over most of the original innovation from the performative before, is the act of doing something in saying something. So that was the promise before. It happened in me saying it. So the fact of it's when you say it, so when you're promising, thanking, asking, naming, all that, then it happens in the act. And then the perlocutionary act is when you do something by saying something. So it's effects you have. You can scare someone, or you can bore someone, or whatever. That's an effect of what you're saying, but you're not doing it in saying. The distinction between those two latter is clearly where things get a little complicated. So a lot of the book is about sorting that out. And also the discussion in securitization theory has been focusing quite a bit on that. So it's important. And the easy way to check the first approximation of whether you got one or the other is to see if you can use the performative formula of saying, I hereby. So you can say, I hereby warn you, or I hereby order you. But I can't say, I hereby scare you, or I hereby promise you. There's a causal relationship between what I do and what you do. It's an external causal relationship, different from the locutionary act, where it's happening in saying it. So there's a difference between the locutionary, where it happens in the very act, and the perlocutionary, which is a more classical cause-effect one. Which also means that this is part of what makes the illocution is interesting, is that it's not a cause-effect relationship. It does not follow externally the way that that normal things do. Then, and this is also, just to foreshadow one of the conclusions, the Balzac critique kind of basically gets it wrong, because he has figured out the thing that perlocution is about effects, and then saying because securitization is about the effects you have of your speech act, it must be perlocution. But that is wrong, because it only means perlocution is one kind of effect, illocution is another kind of effect. Actually, the interesting kind of effect, the one that gets you unique theoretical possibilities. So the fact that something has effects doesn't mean the perlocution, it only if it's external cause-effect relations. Okay. What sequence to say this in? No. I'm not going to go through this in detail. Just say, if you look at things up in a philosophy of language textbook or something like that, saying what has happened to speech act theory, then the more narrow discussion in speech act theory is focused on two different versions: a conventionalist version, which is mainly associated with Searle, and an intentionalist one associated with Strawson. And then to some extent there is a third, which is the one I'm going to build on, which has the main theories being Marina Spisa, who was one of the people who edited and transcribed and published the original How to Do Things with Words. This is slightly misleading, so I'm mainly saying it in sense of don't get bogged into this, because ultimately the problem is really that both the intentionalist and the conventionalist one have too much of intentions, and that the use of conventions in Searle is problematic. So let me go more straight to, put it like this. Most of the mainstream work on speech act theory has assumed that it's about conveying an intention to an audience. So if you translate the argument from before about the promise, the heart of the speech act that is happening there is that I somehow have an intention to do something, and I might have an intention to make a promise, and it has succeeded. I've succeeded in that speech act when I've gotten you to understand that that was my intention. So I'm communicating a state of mind to you, and you have to get that that is my state of mind. When that has succeeded, the act is becoming out. So this means that it's reduced to states of mind, to communication, and to transferring things from one head to another. The classical model of communication, which exactly was what Austin wanted to get away from. It was not a theory of communication, it was a theory of action, and it was a theory of action that happened in the social relations and the statuses between people, etc. The most famous developer of the theory is Searle, and everyone recognized that in some sense it was maybe helpful because it was presented in a much more conventional way, and it made clear typologies and so on. But the kind of speech act theory we get through Searle, and which has dominated the landscape since, is about the mechanical version, which is called conventionalist, because the idea is that there are conventions that regulate what will count as what. Meaning that if we have established certain conventions, then making a statement, like I did before, counts as a promise. So it's a kind of machine that is set up. We have set up a machine of conventions that makes certain statements count in certain ways, and you then can check, in a sense, from the outside whether you have succeeded in doing a speech act. Because if you have followed those rules, then it has happened. And that is not surprising given the whole philosophical project of Searle and the state of American philosophy at the time, etc., etc. But it takes out the radical nature of something that happens, the fact that it's not communication, and the fact that it's, first of all, an act that transforms the socio-political relations among people. So, in that sense, it's a problematic development, and especially on elocution, it's important to go back and say, what is it that constitutes elocution? And here I'm following very much Marina Spisa's argument. In Austin says that elocution is characterized by three things. And especially the first has been misunderstood and made a lot of trouble. The first is uptake, which basically is that you understand what is going on, we speak the same language, and you therefore get what I'm saying, and so on. So when I made my promise earlier, uptake is that you somehow understand well enough what I'm saying, and therefore it's being communicated as that. Then the second point is what I've said before, that it takes effect in a different way from cause-effect relations. That it has this constitutive nature, that it is happening in the performative constitutive way, not as an external relationship between what one is doing and what effect it has on someone else. And then, which I'm not going to go much into here, it often invites a response or sequel, but having to do with the fact that it's established as a conventional phenomenon and therefore can be undone. Almost all of the philosophy of language people and the linguists and so on who use speech tag theory focused only on the first, on uptake, making it as if uptake was the point. But for Austin, it was more or less just a necessary condition, because if you didn't understand the language because of my thick European accent, didn't understand what I was saying, then it didn't work. But that is only a condition, it's not the point of it. But that is what has happened to speech tag theory. Then it was the point. As if the whole thing about speech tag was this communication of my state of mind into your head and so on. So uptake is not the point, uptake is just a condition. And what has happened thereby is the speech tag theory has been reduced to a theory of communication, which is exactly what it should not be. And this means, of course, also, as a backside of that, that then effects are more or less perlocution, because the only effect you can look at are the perlocutionary ones, because you have no effect in the illocutionary one. The illocutionary one is just the communication and the uptake. All of that, I think, has been clarified very well by Spicer and others who have gone back to Austin. And I think it's important here to say, what is it then that illocution is, especially for our purpose? The focus then is the change in the interpersonal relationship. Again, the example from before, that when I make a promise, then there's a difference in change to our relationship. I owe you something, you are owed that, and you can afterward complain when I didn't end in time, and blah, blah, blah. All of that is the key event that happened in this moment. In a more technical language, it can be constituted in terms of deontic modal competences, meaning that these are basic modal categories of rights and obligations, etc. They are deontic in the terms of they are about rights and so on, and they are being a constellation that we are configuring and reconfiguring when we do something like this. And just for once to remind us that we're talking about securitization theory, in there is the key move, not so much about the threat, it's not so much about the fact that we're talking about whether the Russians are bad or not, but if I convince you, securitize the issue, Russia is a threat, what has happened is that we have a different political relationship over the Russia issue, that now you expect to be defended, but you also granted me the right to defend you with extraordinary measures, etc., etc. That key transformation in the politics of this issue is what constitutes the securitization, not the threat perception. So that's why it matters to have the focus exactly on this transformation of the deontic modal competences. Then more quickly, we can say the effect here is clearly co-produced by speaker and audience. That's important for some of the discussions. It's a theory that clearly has quite a strong theoretical ambition, in the sense that Austin was famous for being skeptical of hasty theorizing and warning that most often we move too quickly in theorizing. But actually, there's a quite high valuation of categories here. I mean, the idea is, after all, that a thing like a promise has qualities, and you can talk about what's the nature of a promise, and going into a category like that helps you. So that's also why Austin, in some places, played around with the idea of calling his own project linguistic phenomenology, that it is the idea of saying that phenomena like promises and excuses and so on have inner structural features that which you try to understand. And that's why he was critical of his parallel philosopher at the time, Wittgenstein, who was in many other ways doing something similar in that other university town, that he complained that Wittgenstein just ended up making a theory of an unlimited amount of possible language games, which Austin found was not very satisfactory. I managed to tell myself. That you end up thereby having to map every unique process, which becomes a problem, as we'll see, with the sociological version of the speech act theory as well, that in a sense you have to follow every state of mind and perception and psychological being of one person, what that does to the next one, what that does to the next one, etc. A total map of one-to-one of everything that happens with no strong theoretical concepts. But the idea in Austin is you want strong theoretical concepts, in the sense you want to understand something about promises as promises, or securitization as securitization, etc. I have then in the paper version of this a long section which I'm going to summarize super brutally here, which is that part of the complication of understanding this has to do with something that happened to another of Austin's concepts, which is performative. And performative is a word we all use a lot nowadays. It's often thrown in as a kind of magic word. Something is performative, and that explains a lot. But it actually means very different things for very different people. It almost means the opposite, actually, of what between the different usages. For Austin, performative was this that we talked about. He introduced performative as the contrast to consultative. It was the idea of something happening in the language, something new happening that wasn't there before. So you're constituting something that wasn't there. So something new is conjured into being in the performative. The most influential theorist, I guess, nowadays on performativity is Judith Butler. And that's a very different argument, right? There is the argument that how we shape ourselves as gendered subjects through the performance of a set of acts, a kind of stylized repetition of certain acts. And one of the advantages there is, of course, that resonates better with the theatrical metaphorics of performance and so on. But it doesn't capture the productive moment when something is produced that wasn't there. It's mostly about the repetitive. That's why it teamed up so well with some of the other tendencies today of looking at the everyday and the mundane and so on. The fact that all the seemingly small events and actions and so on all come together as the way we could use ourselves. But that's in a sense almost the opposite of what the performative was in Austin. And I'm not saying that one is right and the other is wrong here. We probably need both concepts, and probably the best thing we could do would simply to call them different things and keep going at performativity on both of these interesting research agendas. But the problem with the dominance of the Butler agenda is that fewer and fewer people are aware of the other possibility of using performative in the Austin sense, which has the radical constituting something new meaning that is not in the Butler version. Now let me finally get back to the discussion in securitization theory, and I'll do that a bit kind of schematically, because both for time, but also because maybe less necessary than it is to go through the speech actually. Back to Balzac and his article in 2005 in European Journal of International Relations. That I will comment on two levels. One, which is maybe most interesting for myself and just for my vanity or whatever. So that's just for the record to say that I was right and he was wrong. So that's basically on speech act theory as such. But that's not so important. I mean, you might get to interesting places by doing something wrong. There is such a thing as productive misunderstanding. So maybe he created the better version of speech act theory, nevertheless, even of securitization theory. So I'll be more interested in that afterward. But if you just look at the original argument, it wants to say that the Copenhagen version has this kind of internalist sense of the speech act, that is something that is done when you say it. So it's the subject only doing it, it's not relational, it's not truly intersubjective, despite us saying so, and it's conventionalist. If you've performed according to the rules, it has happened. That would only be true if it was based on the Searle version of the theory. It is very clear if you check the footnotes, it says Austin and Derrida, not Searle. So that's a bit strange, and Reviewer 2 told him so, I know. But still, for some reason it's assumed that it's the Searle version of speech act theory that is at play. And therefore, you can kind of check from the outside, you follow the convention, therefore you did. And it assumes that it's done by the actor alone and so on. All of that is really simple. And then it assumes that if there's anything about effects, it has to be perlocution, because perlocution is the kind of effect side of speech act theory, which is wrong, because as we saw, elocution is just one kind of effect, perlocution is another kind of effect, and elocution is the interesting one. So all of that is really just wrong. But as I said, and then just to complete it, he has tried in a later version without acknowledging that the first one was wrong, and where he also reverses the role. Then he's speaking Searle to me. He's saying then the securitizing move is elocution, and securitization as such is perlocution. That is in a sense just even more problematic because then you are dislodging the actor from the effect in a problematic way, etc. Okay, that's all very technical and not so interesting. More interesting is which version of the securitization theory is better, which one is more useful, what are the effects of doing it one way or the other. So, in his terminology, there is one version in Copenhagen, which he calls philosophical, which I find a bit strange. I would prefer to have it called political, if it should be, and then his own is sociological. The sociological is probably capturing some of it, because it has this feature of being a little more micro, being about the perceptions and the interactions and so on, and mapping all of that. Philosophical, I guess, hints to the fact that there's too much Derrida in my version, and it has too much power to language and something like that. So the contrast is that the Copenhagen version is focusing on the speech act as such, whereas the alternative version has a broader conception of pragmatic processes. The Copenhagen one is self-referential in the sense that something happens in that moment when you constitute something as securitization, whereas the other one focuses more on processes. There's a focus on illocution versus perlocution, as we talked about. There's a performative versus cause-effect. I think it's important that one is focused on events, the other on processes. The focus in the classical version of securitization is on the difference it makes that something has become a security issue. That something has happened. If something becomes a security issue, it is different. That makes a difference. And that is, in a sense, the whole point of making a securitization analysis of something. Whereas the emphasis in the other are to say we can better understand why something becomes possible if you understand more about the context. I could say a lot about context, which I have a long argument about, but I'll spare it for that for now. It's a point in the classical version to say the audience is integral to the analysis, because given that securitization is about justifying something, about changing the nature of something, there has to be an audience accepting it. It is a relationship. It is an between securitizing actor and the audience. There has to be an audience. Whereas in the sociological version, there is the audience is not defined in the integral circular way as being part of the particular situation. It is predefined, and it's possible sometimes that the audience doesn't matter. Which ironically then means that then actually you can do it yourself as a securitizing actor, which was the criticism launched the other way around. There's much focus in the classical version of actually having a theory, while there's more emphasis in the alternative version of being able to map with more detail and so on. And all of this is, I'm trying to be almost fair here in the sense that as you can see, there are some qualities to the second one as well. I mean, it is nice to be able to map more in detail. It is nice to cover context and so on. So it's not necessarily wrong, but you also have to be aware what is the price you pay? What is it you then sell out in order to get there? Because at first, and that's the reason why I'm generally losing this game, of course, so that everyone who is confronted with these two and told you can have a narrow version which has a very simplified version, a very specific concept, or you can have a broader theory that includes everything. Then most buyers will say, I think I take the broad version with everything. So most people at first would think you get more by having the sociological version. And then the point is to say, what is it that was the point in trying to make it the other way? What is it that you might be losing by doing that? And that, for me, has a lot to do with the politics of it. That it's the understanding of what is happening politically, which you don't have if you look at it as a process. Might be overdoing my joke about not keeping a promise, so maybe I will skip this one. I think I can do that. Yeah. Although the single images, we'll probably get back to that. I think the main point of the point that I was making with this figure earlier on, and which is basically this, that securitization is not about perceptions, it's about one particular form of processing an issue by us as society. We're dealing with this issue in security mode instead of dealing with it in another mode, is that you can in that say you constitute a particular political constellation that runs in the form of protection or in the form of something else, etc. That means that something happens in this big text. So this is a model that I've used in some other articles, and that it's important to have this distinct idea of saying the first part of a securitization analysis is truly political in the sense you can never causally explain what is happening. Something is always open what is being done politically. Then something happens, and that what happens has made a difference so that afterwards things are different. Let me illustrate briefly what I think can be done with that. If we widen our perspective beyond securitization and say we talk about 3 different forms of dealing with future bads, you can say securitization you could compare to then riskification and uncertainty making. I'm not going to unfold this whole argument, but I'm happy to discuss it in further. You can say what characterizes dealing with things in security mode is that it has this protection defense mode, and thereby also the mandating of the protector to do extreme things in order to protect. That is one form of policy. If you constitute something as a risk instead, you are saying that it's a question for expertise, for balancing optimizing one risk against another, which is the whole domain of experts. That links a bit to the expertise book here and so on. So you get a kind of expert measurements and balancing, but not the promise that there's something we will, for all means, prevent from happening. That is implied in securitization. Something is not allowed to happen under any circumstances, and because that has to be prevented, we are accepting extreme measures. If we deal with it in risk mode, we are not saying it has to be ruled out. We're saying we have to balance various risks, and we need experts in order to do that, and then you get a completely different form of politics. And if you constitute something as uncertainty, as basically unknowable, as we do on certain issues, we have done it on terrorism in periods and on other issues, then you get another kind of politics. Then you get a kind of politics where you have to get, in a sense, justify yourself post hoc because no one can know in advance what was right to do. So you have to afterwards be forgiven for what you did, etc. All of this is to say that the whole idea that you can constitute different forms of politics, I think, hinges on the idea that something happens in the mode of securitization. Another way of saying it is that it's a way of seeing how we, within the political field, can move into different forms of politics. So security politics is in a sense a kind of anti-politics, risk a kind of post-politics, uncertainty a kind of sub-politics in the Beck sense. So this idea that the theory are these kind of constitutive moments where you move into specific domains, that is a quality which you get by having this strong concept. And again, this is in contrast to thereby the focus is the particular social state of being that we are constituting, in contrast to the more detailed study of the processes whereby the complex interactions of everyone with their different states of being and states of mind and so on interact to produce things in a processed way. So this securitization in that sense is the particular kind of event that a situation is structured in that way, is brought about in that specific way. It's a meta-political event that tells you about different forms of politics. It doesn't have to be constantly the same. It can be constantly renegotiated what it is, but it's a recognizable phenomenon that we can deal with things in the security mode and thereby play that particular card and get that form of politics. Then the final point, which I advertised in the beginning with my 3 bullet points of what is important to do here, is that that all of this has to do with reflecting a bit on the politics of making theory. We all know that academic world is political. That's ultimately a kind of linguistic term, to some extent. We all know that you can't separate what we are doing from what practitioners do. It's one continuous whole. The medium we are working on is language. The medium that the politics is done in is language. There's no clear dividing line. So what we're doing is political. There's no way of saying that things can only be done in one way. So we're always making a choice. What we're doing is political. So writing academic text is political. that's how do you deal with that? Well, that's easier if you're writing directly into a context. If you're engaging in some specific subject, you can probably feel how what you're doing is interacting with what people are doing in that field. If you're writing theory, it's a little more difficult to say what's the politics of a theory, because that can be mobilized in very different contexts. How can you think about the politics of making a theory? Then it has to be, in a sense, the structure or the architecture of the theory that somehow conditions what you can do with it and what you can't do. And there, for me, it has been important all along to think that it's important that the theory protects that political moment. You don't have a causal process that can override the political consistency of the movement, because that actually becomes politically dangerous. You have to protect that political moment. You have to have a theory that is structured around the key moment when something happens politically that is irreducible and non-predictable. So in that sense, for me, it has been important to, in that sense, structure the theory in certain ways exactly for political moments, because then it will keep responsibilizing, pointing out that you're doing things that people can never hide behind causal explanations or hide behind objective explanations, etc. So, and therefore it's also important to have strong theoretical concept and to have a strong theoretical core. And all of this is strangely necessary in the sense that one of the key repeated kind of misdeeds of political science seems to be to try to erase politics. I mean, most of our theories try somehow to avoid politics being in the field we study. And therefore, we have to know whenever you make a theory, the most important thing is to prevent people from getting rid of the politics, because that's what they try to do, because that's what political science does. So, in that sense, there is a political choice in your choice of theory. So I think I'll end it here of saying that in that sense, the whole thing is a reflective act in the sense of thinking, as a theorist, what is the theory act you're making, and what's the securitizing and desecuritizing effect of making a certain kind of theory. So in that sense, I hope the theory and all the complicated argument applies to the theory itself.